They did not need a statement when a picture would do, so the Crown produced the simplest antidote to a week of they aren't speaking headlines. Father and heir shoulder to shoulder, moving in lockstep, faces composed, cadence measured, the kind of proximity you stage only when the narrative requires a reset. And yes, the timing was the point because the oxygen had been feeding a single idea that William's Apple TV Plus candor with Eugene Levy about change for good had landed like a dart in the family carpet. That Rob Shutter's line about no calls, no texts, no meetings had hardened into a presumption of frost, and that the king had read betrayal between the words. The counterpunch was visual rather than verbal, a deliberate tableau that reasserted the chain of command and reassured every stakeholder that the succession remains orderly even if private disagreements are being worked through offstage, which is precisely how a constitutional monarchy prefers it, by accretion not explosion. Look past the choreographed calm and you see a longer arc that predates this flare-up. William has been road-testing a modern register for months, not by tearing banners down but by sanding edges earthshot framed around the 2030 cliff edge with urgent optimism instead of apocalypse, a Windsor-first domestic rhythm that privileges family texture over marble grandeur, the screen-time red lines at home that match Catherine's early years push against a widening epidemic of disconnection, the now familiar line that tradition must be fit for purpose today rather than embalmed for its own sake, and the little signals inside the machine such as ties optional when the prince drops into duchy offices and fewer monogrammed flourishes on the household's accoutrements, none of which, taken together, amounts to rebellion so much as continuity by other means. If anything it echoes the method Charles perfected as Prince of Wales: update what you can, preserve what you must, keep the sermon short and the service long, and that is why Robert Lace's pushback matters, not merely because it contradicts the feud copy, but because it reframes the Levy remarks as inheritance planning rather than patricide, a critique of patterns rather than of parents, a promise of edits rather than erasures, and a reminder that the non-negotiable center of his future reign is a protected family core where warmth, safety, and routine outrank spectacle. Still, October has been crowded and the optics calculus is real. The York turbulence refuses to die down, the Sussex rumour mill keeps floating its own Thor narratives, the Wales family's shift within Windsor is midstream, Earthshot is accelerating toward Rio, and the press will always read distance into a day without a photo and war into a sentence about change, which is why a clean father and son frame was necessary, not to close policy debates but to keep the public covenant stable while those debates proceed in private. Unity theatre only works if the subplots do not contradict it, and the current palace playbook reflects that awareness, treating Andrew with containment rather than conflagration because punishment without leverage risks a tell-all thermonuclear event, entertaining controlled pathways for limited Sussex re-entry when they align with national interest because shutting every door feeds grievance economics, and at the same time giving the heir room to trim the costume obsession that looks like fancy dress in Unforgiving. 4K, to rebalance Garter Day toward Hanorés instead of ostrich plumes, and to keep the carriages when they mean something while letting the velvet hang in storage when it does not. The Doctor Who analogy that senior aides love, the next sovereign must be completely different but also a bit the same, isn't a joke. It is the institutional doctrine, and you can see its fingerprints everywhere. Charles leaning into the patience his mother taught him, the long view that smooths family flashpoints and protects the brand's soft power abroad. William leaning into usefulness over mystique without forfeiting the mystique that underwrites legitimacy at scale, Kate backing the rhetoric with practice by banning phones for the children and writing plainly about what constant distraction does to the nervous system of a household, and remaining the iron metronome of duty, Edward carrying Philip's Taverner's baton, Eugenie adding Youthart's patronage lanes, even the physical geography shifting, with Windsor growing as an operating base because it reads as human and sustainable while Buckingham Palace reserves its sovereign theatrics for when theatrics still convert. Taken together, the moves draw a map of a crown that intends to sell competence with a little ceremony on the side rather than ceremony with a little competence hidden somewhere in the footnotes, which is why yesterday's joint frame matters beyond the photograph, because donors, diplomats, dioceses, and tabloids all needed the same reassurance that the top of the pyramid is synchronized. And because perception compounds, so a rumor of silence between king and prince would metastasize every other subplot: Andrew, Meghan, staffing, spending, even Earthshot, into a referendum on institutional instability, whereas a few minutes of engineered togetherness bleeds that risk away and buys time for the real work. None of this means there are no sharp edges in private, since every dynasty experiences tactical cooling when an heir tests new language and a monarch measures consequence, but a pause is not a break, and the Windsor machine is set up to manage friction by calendar rather than by press release, so expect more vignettes of coordinated duty in the coming weeks, statecraft where Charles leads and William shadows, earthshot where William leads and Charles blesses, appearances where both occupy the frame to telegraph baton discipline, and meanwhile expect the heir to keep piloting small trims that make the institution read as human first without collapsing into celebrity. Because the trap for modernizers is to amputate the very theatre that pays the bills, and the trap for traditionalists is to confuse costume for meaning. On this, the palace seems unusually aligned, with historians whispering do not dumb it down because you cannot always stitch it back, and communications hands repeating the mantra purpose over pageantry except where pageantry equals purpose. Weave back in the family texture that has been driving so much of the public empathy, the candid admission that 2024 was brutal, the humility in saying remission is relief without recklessness, the quiet protocol for telling children hard news without terror, the pact that one parent remains on the school-run grid even if it means Kate missing Rio, the simple joys of a dog under an oak and a dinner table without phones, and you can see the outline of a Wales reign that intends to model ordinary steadiness at home and measurable impact in public while retaining just enough velvet and trumpet to make Britain look like itself on global screens. The media will keep cycling feud stories whenever there's a quiet fortnight because conflict is coin, the court will keep answering with images rather than indictments because that is what the crown is built to do, and somewhere between those two rhythms a succession will be managed so that the country is handed from one pair of steady hands to another without dropping the crown in the middle. That, ultimately, is what the latest joint outing said out loud without saying anything at all, that continuity and change are not enemies in this house but partners, that the heir's change for good is being layered onto the sovereign's slow, steady stewardship, and that when the rumour mill runs hot the palace will do what it has always done best: close the loop in public, keep the work in private, and let the image carry the message until the temperature drops.